The Second World War is remembered through the lens of decisive battles, iconic leaders, and the triumphant liberation of nations from tyranny. Yet, for every event inscribed in textbooks, there exist files sealed under lock and key, buried in archives, or deliberately destroyed to prevent the world from seeing the darker truths. These are not tales of glory or strategy. They are the hidden records of operations so disturbing, so politically dangerous, that both victors and vanquished conspired to erase them from memory. They stretch from the frozen forests of Eastern Europe to secret camps in Siberia, from the blood-stained beaches of France to the corridors of Allied high command. The documents, when they surface, are often fragmentary: blurred photographs, scorched field reports, intercepted communiques, or testimonies whispered decades later by survivors long silenced. Together, they form a shadow history, an account of a war fought not just on battlefields, but also in classified directives, backroom deals, and moral compromises too shameful to admit. Today, under the title 5 Disturbed WWII Operations That Were Erased from Human Memory, we reopen these forgotten files, examining evidence that was meant never to be seen. What follows is not victory or pride, but a reckoning with what powerful men were willing to sacrifice, conceal, and erase in the name of survival. Chapter 1. The Classified Massacre at Lvov Forest. In the summer of 1941, as the thunder of Hitler's armies rolled eastward into Soviet-occupied Poland, the city of Lvov, now Lviv in western Ukraine, stood at the crossroads of destruction. For the civilians who lived there, the front lines were only days away, yet the danger did not come solely from the Germans. Deep within the Soviet security apparatus, the NKVD, the feared secret police, received direct orders to enact a brutal directive. It was known by a chillingly simple phrase: Operation Purge. The logic was as cold as the bureaucratic language it was written in. Any prisoners who might collaborate with the advancing Wehrmacht, any intellectuals, priests, officers, or political dissenters who could serve as a rallying point, were to be eliminated before German forces arrived. The forests surrounding Lvov became the staging ground for this clandestine bloodletting. From June 22nd, the day Operation Barbarossa began, until the first week of July, thousands of captives were marched under guard into the thick woods on the city's outskirts. Eyewitness fragments, recovered years later from half-burned testimonies, describe men and women bound in groups of 50, forced to kneel in pits carved hastily into the earth. Execution squads, their faces hidden beneath Soviet helmets and greatcoats, fired into the backs of skulls with pistols and submachine guns. The reports speak of screams muffled by artillery barrages in the distance, of soil stained black by blood, and of lime powder poured over bodies to hasten decomposition. Some accounts mention Orthodox priests reciting prayers before being silenced by rifle fire. Others describe the hollow eyes of children dragged into the forest, their cries lost in the roar of gunfire. The German advance reached Lvov by the end of June, and as Wehrmacht units pushed into the city, they stumbled upon evidence of slaughter. In prison basements and shallow pits, bodies were found piled in grotesque heaps. Photographs taken by German propagandists show corpses still in shackles, faces frozen in terror, the stench of lime filling the air. Berlin quickly seized upon this discovery, labeling it proof of Bolshevik barbarism, and using it to justify their own campaign of terror against the Soviet population. For Nazi propaganda, the massacre was an opportunity, but in the fog of war, truth itself became a casualty. For the Soviets, denial was immediate and absolute. Moscow labeled the atrocity a fabrication of Goebbels' ministry, a grotesque lie meant to discredit the Red Army's retreat. What makes the Lvov massacre disturbing is not merely the scale of killing, but the layers of erasure that followed. During the war, the Soviet Union successfully buried responsibility beneath the mountain of Nazi crimes. After 1945, when the world's attention shifted to the Nuremberg trials, evidence of Soviet atrocities was carefully controlled. American OSS officers operating in newly liberated zones gathered fragments of testimony from Polish exiles. Some reports reached London, stamped confidential, and routed to British intelligence. Yet the political calculus of the time was ruthless. Stalin was not just an ally, he was the indispensable force crushing the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. To accuse him of massacres in Lvov, just 2 years after the discovery of Katyn, threatened to fracture the Grand Alliance. The files were locked away, marked as unreliable wartime propaganda, and quietly forgotten. Survivors who escaped the NKVD's bullets carried their memories into exile. In displaced persons camps across Europe, whispers circulated of entire families vanished, of professors and doctors dragged from their homes at midnight, of priests who disappeared after sermons condemning Soviet rule. Yet when these accounts reached Western officials, they were met with silence. The onset of the Cold War only deepened the suppression. To acknowledge Lvov was to validate Nazi evidence, a political impossibility in the face of rising East-West hostility. Thus, for decades, the massacre remained a phantom crime, its traces visible only in the margins of destroyed documents and survivor laments. One remarkable source surfaced in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. In a regional archive near Kiev, researchers uncovered a bundle of NKVD operational reports dated June 1941. Among them was a chilling directive authorizing the liquidation of counter-revolutionary elements in western Ukraine. The document bore signatures of mid-ranking NKVD officers, their names barely legible, their authority derived from Moscow. Cross-referencing these files with German wartime photographs and Polish underground testimonies revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. The massacre had happened. It had been ordered, executed, and covered up with ruthless efficiency. Forensic investigations in the early 2000s brought further confirmation. Mass graves unearthed near Zamostyniv prison in Lvov revealed skeletal remains consistent with execution-style shootings. Bullet casings identified as Soviet-manufactured matched the time period. Personal items, a priest's crucifix, a student's diary, military badges stripped from uniforms, spoke to the lives extinguished in those forests. The evidence once denied now lay bare in the earth, but the question remained. Why was Lvov not remembered alongside Katyn, Babyn Yar, or other wartime massacres? The answer lies in the delicate balance of wartime narratives. To recognize Lvov meant admitting that Stalin's regime committed mass murder even as it fought Hitler. For Western powers invested in post-war stability, such truths were too explosive to handle. The chilling detail is how deliberate the erasure became. Soviet censors not only denied the crime, they rewrote the narrative. Schoolbooks in post-war Ukraine painted the NKVD as protectors of the people. German atrocities were emphasized, Soviet crimes excised. Even family members of the disappeared were pressured into silence, warned that speaking of loved ones would mark them as enemies of the state. Silence was enforced not only by censorship, but by fear of persecution. Generations grew up unaware that their grandfathers or uncles had been marched into the forest and shot. The Lvov massacre remains a haunting example of how history can be engineered, manipulated, and suppressed. It demonstrates the power of propaganda to transform victims into ghosts, their memory erased not by the passing of time, but by deliberate acts of concealment. Today, in the quiet forests of western Ukraine, small memorials stand where the killings took place. They are modest. Crosses, plaques, stones inscribed with names painstakingly reconstructed from fragmentary records. Yet even these markers cannot fully convey the magnitude of what happened there in those 3 nights of June 1941. As with so many suppressed events of the war, Lvov confronts us with questions that cut to the core of history itself. How many massacres remain unacknowledged, sealed in vaults, or buried beneath official lies? How many voices were extinguished not only by bullets, but by silence? And most disturbingly of all, what bargains were struck between governments, both East and West, to ensure that some truths never emerged into the light? In the classified files labeled Lvov in the ashes of destroyed documents, and in the faint testimonies of survivors, we glimpse an answer too disturbing to forget, yet one that the world tried so hard to erase. Chapter 2. Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. Siberia. The name Unit 731 has become synonymous with horror, a secret Japanese biological warfare program that conducted human experimentation in Harbin, Manchukuo, under the command of General Shiro Ishii. But fewer know that the scope of Japan's medical war crimes extended beyond Manchuria, reaching deep into Soviet territory during the fragile months of 1941 and 1942. Recently unearthed Soviet files and scattered American intelligence reports suggest that a lesser-known offshoot, codenamed Detachment R, operated covertly near Siberian borderlands, carrying out experiments on captured Soviet prisoners. These operations were deliberately buried after the war, erased through a mix of Cold War politics and scientific secrecy. Their traces survive only in fragments, burned reports, coded messages, and testimonies whispered decades later by survivors who were never meant to live. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Japan seized the opportunity to advance its own shadow agenda. While officially neutral under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, Tokyo still eyed Siberia as a vulnerable flank. Detachment R, believed to be under the technical supervision of officers trained by Unit 731, was deployed along secret camps hidden near Blagoveshchensk and Khabarovsk. The existence of these sites came to light only in 1949, during the Soviet Khabarovsk war crimes trials, when Japanese officers admitted, under pressure, to conducting human experimentation outside Harbin. However, the details were quickly dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda, largely because Washington had already begun recruiting former Unit 731 scientists for their expertise in biological warfare, mirroring the infamous Operation Paperclip. Survivor testimonies tell of experiments designed to weaponize the Siberian climate itself. Prisoners, mostly Red Army soldiers, captured during border skirmishes and civilians accused of espionage, were stripped naked and left in sub-zero temperatures, while doctors recorded the progression of frostbite hour by hour. Victims' limbs were plunged into icy water, then exposed to bitter wind until skin crystallized and broke away like glass. In other chambers, men were sealed into low-oxygen compartments to simulate high-altitude conditions faced by bomber crews. Many died gasping, their lungs ruptured, their bodies discarded into snow pits. Prisoners who contracted pneumonia or gangrene were not treated. Instead, the infection was monitored with clinical precision. Notes were scribbled in neat Japanese handwriting, cataloguing how long it took for tissue to rot, for fevers to spike, for death to come. These records, when they later surfaced, were written with the detachment of a laboratory report, cold data, devoid of humanity. Biological agents also played a role. Anthrax spores, cholera cultures, and even plague-infested fleas were tested on live captives. Prisoners were fed contaminated food or injected with bacteria under the guise of vaccination. Some accounts describe cages of fleas released into barracks, the men scratching themselves raw before collapsing in fever. Entire groups perished, their corpses burned in open pits to prevent contamination. Soviet investigators who interviewed villagers in the Amur region decades later collected rumors of sudden outbreaks during the war years, illnesses that spread rapidly and then vanished, leaving no official trace. These outbreaks were never recorded in Red Army medical logs, suggesting a cover-up from the highest levels. What makes the story even more disturbing is the fate of Detachment R's personnel after Japan's surrender. Unlike many war criminals who faced execution, several scientists and physicians connected to Unit 731 and its Siberian branch were quietly transferred to the United States. American intelligence, eager to secure an advantage in biological warfare during the early Cold War, offered immunity in exchange for research data. Reports indicate that crates of documents, some water-stained, others half-burned, were shipped from Japan to US military laboratories in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Within these files were detailed charts from Siberian experiments, data too valuable to destroy. For the Soviets, who uncovered only fragments of the program, this betrayal deepened the rift with Washington, feeding suspicion that America was complicit in shielding mass murderers. The erasure of Detachment R was deliberate and systematic. The Japanese government denied its existence, the US buried the evidence under classified projects, and the Soviets inflated certain details while downplaying others to maintain their narrative. Historians attempting to reconstruct the truth find themselves caught between propaganda, secrecy, and silence. The few documents that remain, a confiscated surgical kit, faded photographs of barracks, interrogation transcripts from Khabarovsk, paint an incomplete but chilling picture. It is a story of science twisted into cruelty, of medicine weaponized in the pursuit of empire, and of knowledge purchased with human suffering. One particularly haunting testimony came from a Soviet soldier captured in 1942. In a declassified KGB report, he described being restrained on a wooden table, while doctors applied alternating hot and cold compresses to his frostbitten limbs. They were not attempting to heal him. They were observing how quickly necrosis spread when tissue was forced to thaw and refreeze. The soldier survived long enough to be exchanged in a prisoner swap, but his legs were amputated. He later told Soviet investigators that his captors spoke Japanese and wore insignias he had never seen before, not the standard uniform of Kwantung Army doctors. His description aligned with what little is known about Detachment R confirming its presence in Siberia. For decades, survivors like him were silenced. Soviet propaganda weaponized their suffering, while Western historians ignored it, dismissing the Khabarovsk trials as show trials. Only in recent years, with the gradual release of Cold War archives, has the truth begun to surface. Yet full recognition remains elusive. The atrocities of Detachment R never appeared in the Tokyo trials. The names of its doctors were omitted from war crimes rosters. Their research lived on, hidden in classified laboratories, its origins unacknowledged. The world, desperate to move on from the carnage of war, turned a blind eye to the crimes committed in frozen Siberian camps. The forgotten experiments of Unit 731's Siberian branch remind us of a horrifying truth. War does not only destroy through bombs and bullets, it corrodes ethics, perverts science, and twists human ingenuity into instruments of torment. In the silence of snow-covered forests, men were dissected, frozen, and infected, their deaths recorded in neat columns of data. And when the war ended, their suffering was not honored with justice, but commodified, traded like currency between former enemies turned Cold War rivals. This is why Detachment R was erased, because to admit it existed would expose not only Japan's crimes, but also the complicity of powers who chose to bury the evidence. Even today, in the archives of Fort Detrick, in the restricted files of Moscow, and in the fading memories of Siberian villagers, the ghost of Detachment R lingers. It is a reminder of how easily human lives can be reduced to numbers, how knowledge built on cruelty can survive even when its victims are forgotten, and how history itself can be engineered to forget. The snow has long since melted from those camps, but beneath the soil, bones and ash still whisper of experiments too disturbing to ever be fully erased. Chapter 3: Operation Eclipse, the Erased Invasion. In the closing months of the Second World War, as Allied forces pushed across the Rhine and Soviet divisions surged into Poland, the fate of Berlin became the central question of grand strategy. To the public, the Allies projected unity, a coalition of democracies determined to crush fascism and liberate Europe. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was anything but harmonious. Rivalries simmered between generals, suspicions grew among politicians, and the looming shadow of Soviet power haunted every discussion. In this tense atmosphere, a plan was quietly drafted and then buried under layers of secrecy. Its codename was Operation Eclipse. Its aim was nothing less than the lightning seizure of Berlin by Anglo-American forces, even at the cost of catastrophic civilian casualties. This was not the triumphant liberation recorded in textbooks, but an invasion that teetered on the edge of becoming reality, and was then erased to preserve fragile post-war alliances. Operation Eclipse emerged in early 1945, during frantic discussions inside the British War Cabinet and the combined Chiefs of Staff. Winston Churchill, ever wary of Soviet expansion, feared that if the Red Army captured Berlin unopposed, Moscow would dictate the post-war order of Central Europe. Churchill pushed his generals to consider a daring strike. Documents later declassified in the British National Archives reveal his handwritten notes scrawled with urgency: "Berlin must not fall to Stalin." The proposal envisioned a rapid, overwhelming assault using armored spearheads, flame-throwing crocodile tanks, and concentrated aerial bombardments designed to shatter German resistance within 72 hours. Civilian casualties were acknowledged as inevitable, but deemed militarily acceptable in the draft memoranda. The Americans, led by General Eisenhower, were far less enthusiastic, having already committed vast resources to the Ardennes counteroffensive and Rhine crossings. Eisenhower questioned the feasibility of diverting men and material toward Berlin. More importantly, US planners feared the political cost. A Western assault on Berlin, carried out in full knowledge of Soviet claims, could fracture the alliance at the very moment of victory. Eisenhower famously stated in a cable that military considerations, not political ambitions, must guide us. Yet in Whitehall, Churchill remained convinced. For him, Operation Eclipse was not merely a military maneuver, but a political gambit to check Stalin's ambitions. Drafts of the plan reveal chilling details. The Royal Air Force proposed saturation bombing raids on Berlin's remaining infrastructure, despite the city already lying in ruins. Target lists included power stations, bridges, and key residential districts suspected of sheltering German command. Armored divisions under Montgomery's 21st Army Group were designated as the vanguard, supported by American mechanized units diverted from Patton's Third Army. Special Operations detachments from the Special Air Service were to infiltrate the city ahead of the main assault, marking key intersections with flares and seizing government buildings. Even more disturbing were references to chemical contingencies, shorthand for the possible use of smoke and incendiary weapons to flush defenders out of underground tunnels. Evidence of the operation's seriousness comes from logistical traces. Intelligence photographs recovered from Allied archives show massive fuel dumps established in northern France and Belgium in March 1945, supplies far exceeding the requirements of local operations. Prototype crocodile flamethrower tanks were photographed lined up in depots near Calais, their hoses coiled like serpents, ready for deployment. Airfields in the Low Countries were reinforced to handle the sudden surge in sorties that Eclipse would demand. Everything pointed to readiness for a campaign that never officially happened. Why then was Eclipse shelved? The answer lies in the brutal arithmetic of politics. By April, Soviet armies under Marshal Zhukov were already within striking distance of Berlin. To launch Eclipse risked direct confrontation between Western and Soviet troops inside the city, a scenario Churchill might have accepted, but which Eisenhower and Roosevelt refused. With Roosevelt's death in April and Truman newly installed in the White House, American leadership prioritized ending the war swiftly and preparing for operations against Japan. The prospect of losing tens of thousands of men in the rubble of Berlin, while simultaneously igniting a diplomatic crisis with Moscow, proved unacceptable. On April 25, 1945, as Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe, Operation Eclipse was quietly marked for destruction. Official records were sanitized, references erased, and logistical stockpiles reassigned. The plan disappeared from history, leaving only whispers in restricted NATO files. For decades, historians dismissed rumors of Eclipse as conspiracy theories. The overwhelming narrative credited the Soviets with capturing Berlin by right of proximity and sacrifice. Yet fragments surfaced over time. In the 1970s, a retired British officer leaked excerpts of draft memoranda describing a 72-hour firestorm invasion of Berlin. In the 1990s, the opening of certain British archives confirmed the existence of Eclipse as a contingency plan. Though much remained redacted, the revelations ignited debates among scholars. Had Churchill truly intended to order the invasion, or was it merely a bluff to pressure Stalin? The surviving evidence suggests it was more than a bluff. Too many resources had been prepared, too many documents signed, for Eclipse to have been a mere paper exercise. What makes Operation Eclipse haunting is not only its erasure, but its implications. Had it been launched, the civilian death toll in Berlin could have dwarfed the destruction of Dresden. The fragile unity of the Allies might have collapsed before the ink dried on the surrender documents. Germany, already divided, could have become the flashpoint for open conflict between East and West years before the Cold War officially began. Instead, Eclipse was buried, not out of mercy but out of political necessity. Its files were shredded, its photographs classified, its memory excised from the official record. Yet the ghost of Eclipse lingers in every Cold War map, in every division of Berlin, in every wall and checkpoint that split Europe for half a century. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped by what was done, but also by what was prepared and then erased. When we speak of the fall of Berlin, we recall Soviet banners unfurled over the Reichstag. But hidden in vaults, behind redacted paragraphs and missing files, lies another ending, a version where the city was consumed in a Western inferno, where Allied tanks roared through rubble while political alliances collapsed around them. That version never came to pass. Yet for a time, in the spring of 1945, it was written into the plans of men who held the fate of Europe in their hands. And then, just as suddenly, it was erased. Chapter 4. The Disturbing Secrets of Dieppe Raid, August 19th, 1942. Before dawn, nearly 6,000 Allied troops, most of them Canadian, slipped across the English Channel under a veil of secrecy. Their target was the French port of Dieppe, a coastal city held by German forces since 1940. Officially, the operation was presented as a raid, a rehearsal for the future liberation of Europe, a chance to test German defenses and gain valuable experience for the eventual D-Day landings. The narrative given to the public was one of bravery, sacrifice, and learning from mistakes. But buried beneath that official story lies a darker truth, a classified mission layered with deception, betrayal, and objectives never disclosed to the men who stormed the beaches. What unfolded that day was not merely a failed raid, it was a calculated gamble by British intelligence. A secret attempt to seize vital cryptographic material and capture enemy intelligence officers. When the raid collapsed in blood and chaos, thousands of soldiers were left to die on the beaches, their true purpose erased from history. Planning for the raid began in the spring of 1942, under mounting pressure from both Moscow and Washington. Stalin demanded that the Western Allies open a second front to relieve the Soviet Union, which was bearing the full weight of Hitler's armies on the Eastern Front. Churchill, eager to demonstrate action to his uneasy ally, authorized Operation Jubilee, the official codename for the Dieppe raid, but behind the cover story of a test raid, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and MI6 inserted their own hidden agenda. Declassified fragments reveal directives marked Most Secret, instructing specialized commando teams to penetrate German headquarters in Dieppe and seize Enigma rotors, codebooks, and other cryptographic devices. There were also orders to capture or eliminate Abwehr officers reportedly stationed nearby, men suspected of overseeing German counterintelligence operations in occupied France. The Canadians, who made up the bulk of the assault force, were never informed of these objectives. They were told they were participating in a bold strike designed to test German defenses and boost morale. In reality, they were pawns in an intelligence game, far more complex and dangerous than they knew. As their landing craft approached the shore, German defenders, forewarned by broken Allied radio silence and reinforced fortifications, waited in entrenched positions. The beaches, overlooked by steep cliffs and machine gun nests, became killing grounds within minutes of the first wave landing. Eyewitness accounts described the slaughter in harrowing detail. Tanks bogged down in shingle, unable to advance. Infantry pinned against seawalls, mowed down by withering fire. Smoke filled the air as landing craft burned, men leaping into the surf only to be cut down in the water. By mid-morning, the raid had devolved into chaos. Nearly 3,400 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or captured, more than half of the entire force. The few commandos who managed to reach their objectives inside the city encountered fierce resistance. German headquarters had been reinforced, Enigma materials already relocated, and the Abwehr officers nowhere to be found. The intelligence snatch mission collapsed, and with it, the hidden reason for the entire raid. What followed was even more chilling. Communications logs recovered from Canadian archives suggest that when the mission began to unravel, higher command in London made no attempt to extract the stranded troops. Special units tasked with the seizure of intelligence materials were left behind, their retreat blocked, their survival impossible. German records indicate that several captured commandos, later identified as belonging to unmarked MI6 detachments, were executed on Hitler's orders under the infamous Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order of October 1942. Their existence was never acknowledged in official post-war histories. Instead, the disaster at Dieppe was framed as a valuable lesson learned, a costly rehearsal for the later success of Operation Overlord in 1944. Canadian families, mourning the thousands lost, were told that their sons had died for strategy and training. But whispers spread among survivors. Some recalled mysterious officers in unmarked uniforms, carrying satchels they guarded with their lives. Others spoke of unusual orders to storm specific buildings, ignoring tactical objectives in favor of seizing documents. These accounts were dismissed for decades as unreliable. Yet when fragments of classified British files were released in the late 20th century, they confirmed what the veterans had long suspected. The Canadians had been sacrificed to cover an intelligence mission that failed. The aftermath of Dieppe also reveals the lengths to which governments will go to conceal uncomfortable truths. Churchill's cabinet ordered the destruction of sensitive operational logs within weeks of the raid. Surviving documents were sealed under the Official Secrets Act, with release dates pushed back decades. Historians who questioned the official narrative found themselves stonewalled, their requests for access denied. The Canadian government, eager to preserve its alliance with Britain, repeated the rehearsal for D-Day explanation, ensuring that generations grew up believing the raid, though tragic, had been a necessary step toward victory. It was not until survivors began publishing memoirs in the 1970s and 1980s that the suppressed version of events gained traction. They described watching comrades cut down by machine gun fire, while small groups of British commandos slipped past the chaos, heading not for defensive positions, but for city offices and communication hubs. Some remembered orders to protect these men at all costs, even when it meant ignoring cover fire for their own units. The implication was clear. The Canadians had been used as cover for a mission whose true purpose was never shared with them. The disturbing legacy of Dieppe lies not only in the scale of the bloodshed, but in the betrayal of trust. Soldiers sent into battle without knowledge of the true objectives, sacrificed in service of an intelligence operation that achieved nothing. Their deaths reframed as a noble lesson, their suffering hidden beneath layers of propaganda. When veterans tried to speak, their voices were drowned out by official histories that glorified the sacrifice while omitting the secrecy. Only in recent decades, with the slow declassification of wartime intelligence, has the darker truth emerged. Dieppe was not simply a failed raid. It was a forbidden experiment in intelligence warfare, one paid for in Canadian blood. Today, memorials in Dieppe honor the bravery of those who fell. Rows of white crosses line the cemeteries, a testament to courage in the face of impossible odds. Yet behind the solemn ceremonies and official speeches lingers the knowledge that these men were never told why they truly died. The beaches where they bled remain silent, but the classified files whisper a story of betrayal, secrecy, and political expediency. The raid was disturbing not only for its cost, but for what it concealed. That thousands were knowingly sent into a slaughterhouse to serve as cover for a mission erased from memory. That is the secret of Dieppe, a truth as haunting as the battle itself. Chapter 5: Hidden Atrocities of Operation Keelhaul. In the euphoric aftermath of victory in Europe in May 1945, when the streets of London and New York filled with celebrations, a much darker operation was quietly underway across the continent. Its codename was Operation Keelhaul, a term drawn from an old naval punishment in which sailors were dragged beneath the keel of a ship, often to their deaths. The name was grimly appropriate. Under secret agreements with Stalin, British and American forces began forcibly repatriating hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, prisoners of war, forced laborers, Cossack families, and refugees who had fled westward to escape the iron grip of the Soviet regime. Many believed they had finally reached safety in Allied hands. Instead, they were herded onto trains and trucks, delivered back to the Soviet Union, and consigned to execution squads or the frozen wastelands of the Gulag. It was a betrayal so profound that both East and West conspired to erase it from the history books. The roots of Operation Keelhaul lay in the secret clauses of the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in the Crimean resort town, dividing the future of post-war Europe. Among the agreements reached, never fully disclosed to the public, was a promise that all Soviet citizens who found themselves in Allied zones would be returned to Moscow, regardless of their wishes. For Stalin, it was about control and revenge. Many of these men had fought against him, joining German-sponsored units like the Russian Liberation Army, or they had simply been captured as prisoners of war. In Stalin's eyes, their survival was proof of betrayal. For the Allies, the arrangement was seen as a diplomatic necessity, a way to secure Soviet cooperation in the Pacific War and in the new United Nations. Few asked what would happen to those sent back. The implementation of Keelhaul was brutal. In Austria, British forces rounded up entire Cossack camps in June 1945. Families who had surrendered under assurances of safety were suddenly surrounded by armed soldiers, their leaders invited to negotiations with British officers, only to be handed over to Soviet NKVD agents. Eyewitnesses recall scenes of chaos, women clinging to their children, men slashing their throats rather than face deportation, priests leading desperate prayers as troops forced people onto trucks. One British officer later admitted in a private letter that he had never seen such scenes of despair, describing mothers throwing their infants into rivers to spare them from Soviet captivity. These letters were classified for decades, their contents deemed too damaging to Britain's wartime reputation. In Italy, similar operations unfolded. Yugoslav partisans under Tito, coordinating with Soviet agents, demanded the return of displaced persons labeled collaborators. British units complied, sometimes marching unarmed prisoners directly into forests where gunfire echoed minutes later. In one instance, near the town of Bleiburg, thousands of surrendered soldiers and civilians were massacred after being handed over. Survivors who managed to crawl from mass graves later recounted the betrayal to Western journalists. But their stories were dismissed as anti-communist propaganda during the early years of the Cold War. Silence was safer than confrontation. In Germany, American military police carried out their part of the bargain. Soviet prisoners, many of them gaunt and starving from years of forced labor, had celebrated their liberation when American tanks rolled into camps. They believed they were free. Instead, they were marched under bayonet guard to rail depots and loaded onto trains bound east. Some attempted escape only to be shot. Others begged chaplains for protection. A handful of US officers tried to intervene, sending desperate cables up the chain of command. But the orders from above were clear. All Soviet citizens must be returned. The chaplains' protests were filed, stamped classified, and buried in archives until the 1980s. The fate of those repatriated was grimly predictable. Soviet records, opened briefly after 1991, confirm that many were executed upon arrival. Others were shipped to Siberian camps where they perished in forced labor. Their identities erased, their names struck from official registries. Stalin had no interest in sorting collaborators from innocents. To him, they were all traitors, guilty by virtue of survival outside his control. The NKVD handled them with ruthless efficiency, disappearing entire trainloads of returnees without a trace. Even when evidence leaked back to the West, governments chose not to act. To acknowledge the atrocity was to admit complicity. Operation Keelhaul remained hidden for decades. Official histories of the war made no mention of it. Publicly, Allied leaders spoke only of liberation, justice, and the moral victory over fascism. The darker truth, that in their desperation to appease Stalin, they had condemned hundreds of thousands to death, was sealed in classified files. When fragments of the story emerged in the 1970s, they were met with skepticism, dismissed as exaggerations. Only with the release of certain archives in the late 20th century did the full scale become undeniable. Historians began piecing together transport records, survivor testimonies, and declassified correspondence between British and American commanders. The evidence painted a chilling picture. Operation Keelhaul was not a mistake, nor a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, systematic betrayal. The erasure of Keelhaul is perhaps its most disturbing aspect. Unlike battlefield tragedies, which could be explained by fog of war, this was policy, written, signed, and executed with bureaucratic precision. The victims were not faceless enemies. They were men, women, and children who had trusted Allied promises of safety. They waved Allied flags, knelt before tanks, begged for mercy. Their faith was answered with betrayal. Their voices silenced not only by Soviet bullets, but by Western indifference. Their memory was suppressed because it was inconvenient, because it cast shadows on the triumphal narrative of Allied victory. Today, monuments stand in places like Linz and Bleiburg, erected by survivors and descendants who refused to let the memory die. They mark the fields where Cossack horsemen were disarmed, the valleys where refugees were herded, the rivers where families drowned themselves to avoid repatriation. These memorials are quiet, often neglected, their inscriptions ignored by tourists. Yet they bear witness to a hidden chapter of the war, one that challenges the comforting myths of liberation. They remind us that victory was not clean, that alliances were forged not only in principle, but in compromise, and that behind the celebration of VE Day lay screams that no one wanted to hear. Operation Keelhaul forces us to confront a disturbing question. What is the value of victory when purchased at the cost of betrayal? For the men and women dragged onto those trains, there was no liberation, only a new prison. Their erasure was deliberate, their suffering written out of history by the very governments that proclaimed freedom. In the long shadow of the war, their voices echo faintly, demanding recognition. The truth of Keelhaul, hidden for decades, is a reminder that the darkest operations are not those committed by enemies alone, but also those carried out in silence by supposed allies. The files we have unearthed do not sit comfortably alongside parades and monuments. They belong to another world, a world of betrayal, secrecy, and silent suffering. 5. Disturbed WWII operations that were erased from human memory has brought us face to face with the underside of victory, the massacres concealed by advancing armies, the experiments buried in frozen laboratories, the invasions edited out of official histories, the raids whose brutality was sanitized for public consumption, and the betrayals committed in the name of fragile alliances. Together, they form a pattern not of triumph, but of suppression, a reminder that wars are not only fought in the open, but also in the shadows of classified agreements and sealed archives. Even now, many questions remain unanswered. How many more files were destroyed before researchers could uncover them? What testimonies were silenced before they could reach the public? And above all, why do the victors of history fear these truths so deeply that they risked burying them forever? The silence around these operations is not accidental, it is deliberate. To remember them is to admit that victory came at a cost that was hidden from the world. The question that lingers is whether we are finally ready to confront the history we were never meant to know.